Ryan Wells was a builder, not just of structures in the city's rising skyline, but of a future he envisioned for two. He believed, with an earnest simplicity, that provision was the purest form of love. He worked relentlessly, shifts blurring into one long, grueling effort. 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day were not a burden but an investment, a down payment on the comfortable life he planned for himself and Sarah. Their small apartment, nestled in a less-than-ideal neighborhood, was a temporary stop, a stepping stone he was determined to leave behind. Sarah said she valued him. She'd greet him with tired smiles when he finally dragged himself through the door, hours after the city had gone silent. She'd talk about her day, shopping, meeting friends for coffee, sometimes mentioning that friend, Mark. Ryan, exhausted but fueled by purpose, would listen, nodding, his mind already calculating the next day's work, the overtime available, the materials needed for the next big project. He saw Sarah's less demanding life not as idleness, but as the freedom his hard work would one day buy her permanently. He was building a fortress of security, brick by painstaking brick, and Sarah was the queen for whom it was intended. He missed dinners, skipped social gatherings, and saw sunlight only on weekends if he was lucky. His hands were rough, his back ached, and sleep was a luxury. But in the quiet hours before collapsing into bed, he'd look at Sarah, sleeping peacefully beside him, and feel a surge of protective love. This was it, he thought. This was what men did. They provided, they sacrificed, they built. And the woman they built for, who appreciated their effort, that was love. He overlooked the increasing frequency of her late nights out, the vague explanations, the hushed phone calls she took in the other room. He told himself it was just her needing a life outside of his exhausting schedule, needing her friends, especially Mark, that friend she saw so often. He was building their future. She was just passing the time until it arrived. His focus was absolute, his trust implicit. He saw the future, and it blinded him to the present. The first threads of doubt weren't dramatic. They were small, almost imperceptible snags in the fabric of his carefully constructed reality. A faint, unfamiliar cologne on Sarah's jacket one morning, a text message notification flashing across her phone screen while she was in the shower, a snippet of a conversation that didn't quite fit the narrative of a casual friendship. Ryan, ever the observer beneath his quiet exterior, noticed these things. He didn't confront, not yet. His nature was to process, to watch, to understand before acting. He told himself he was being paranoid, that his exhaustion was playing tricks on him, but the snags became more frequent, harder to ignore. Sarah started staying out later, sometimes not coming home until the early hours. Her excuses became flimsy, repetitive. "Girls' night," she'd say, though he'd overhear her on the phone later, using masculine pronouns. "Working late on a project with friends," she'd claim, but her clothes weren't the kind one wore for late-night work sessions, and the friends often seemed to involve just one person, Mark. The contrast between his life and hers became a chasm. He'd come home smelling of sweat and concrete dust, aching in every joint to an empty apartment, or to Sarah just getting ready to leave, dressed meticulously, smelling of perfume that wasn't meant for their quiet evenings in. The silence of the apartment on those nights she was out was deafening, amplifying his fatigue and a nascent, unwelcome suspicion. The unraveling reached its peak on a rainy Tuesday night. Ryan had worked 15 hours, the site was behind schedule, and he'd foregone a meal to finish a crucial task. He was soaked, cold, and utterly spent, but he pushed through the door of their building, picturing a warm shower and Sarah's familiar presence. As he approached their door, he heard muffled laughter from inside, followed by a man's voice, deep, comfortable. It wasn't the voice of a casual friend dropping something off. It was Mark's voice, the kind of voice that belonged, not to the threshold, but inside, comfortably settled. He didn't need to open the door. The sound, the late hour, the countless small inconsistencies finally coalesced into a brutal, undeniable truth. He stood there for a long moment, the rain dripping from his clothes onto the hallway floor, the sound of betrayal echoing in the sudden silence in his head. He hadn't yelled, hadn't pounded on the door. He just heard, saw, and understood. The immediate aftermath of discovery was not a storm, but a deep, unsettling calm. Ryan didn't feel rage. He felt a profound emptiness, as if the future he had been building, the very foundation of his life, had crumbled in an instant. He stood in the hallway outside their apartment door, hearing the low murmur of voices inside, Mark's distinct laugh cutting through the quiet building. The rain continued to fall outside, matching the coldness that was seeping into his bones. He turned away from the door, the click of the lock almost inaudible to him. There was no confrontation, no shouting match, no dramatic scene. That wasn't his way. His pain was internal, a silent implosion. He walked slowly down the stairs, his work boots heavy on the concrete steps, the fatigue of his long day forgotten, replaced by the crushing weight of betrayal. He went to a nearby all-night diner, the kind frequented by shift workers and lost souls. He sat in a booth, staring out the window at the rain-slicked streets, drinking bitter coffee that tasted like ash. Hours passed. He didn't call anyone, didn't vent, didn't rage. He just sat, the images and sounds replaying in his mind, the reality settling in, the countless hours he'd sacrificed, the physical toll, the dreams he'd woven, all for a foundation built on sand, on a lie. As dawn approached, a fierce, silent resolve began to harden within him. He wouldn't beg, wouldn't demand explanations, wouldn't fight for someone who had so casually disregarded his efforts, his trust, him. The silent vow was born in the quiet of that diner. Never again would he sacrifice his well-being, his time, his very life force, without absolute, undeniable reciprocity, without mutual respect. He returned to the apartment building not to confront, but to collect. The sounds from inside were gone. He let himself in with his key. The air felt different, stale, with secrets. He walked past the living room, not looking. He went straight to the bedroom, opened a large backpack he used for work, and quietly packed a few essentials: clothes, toiletries, his wallet, phone, work documents. He left everything else: his tools, his books, his half of the shared life they were supposed to have. He didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say. With the backpack on his shoulder, he took one last long look at the space that had been theirs, felt the cold emptiness of it, and walked out, closing the door gently behind him. The quiet exodus was complete. The days and weeks that followed were a blur of quiet pain and stark self-reflection. Ryan found a small, cheap room to rent in a different part of the city. The contrast with the future he had envisioned was jarring, yet also strangely liberating in its simplicity. He continued to work because that was ingrained in him, but the frantic, goal-oriented drive was gone, replaced by a dull, necessary motion. In the evenings, alone in his sparse room, the silence that had once been his refuge became a torment, filled with echoes of what he had lost and the humiliating truth of how he had been fooled. He didn't talk about it. His pain was a private burden. He ate simple meals, worked, slept, and in the hours in between, he started to read. Anything that might explain the dynamics he had experienced, the blindness he had suffered. He stumbled upon ideas that resonated deeply, often categorized under the umbrella of the red pill philosophy. A complex, often controversial space, but one that, for Ryan, distilled down to a few core transformative truths relevant to his experience. It wasn't about anger or resentment towards others, but about a stark, sometimes painful, look at reality and human nature. The key takeaway for him wasn't a cynical view of relationships, but a necessary shift in perspective. His value wasn't solely tied to his ability to provide. Love wasn't earned through sacrifice alone. Genuine connection required mutual respect, mutual effort, mutual investment. He realized he had been operating from a place of neediness, seeking validation by building a life for someone else, mistakenly believing that his endless sacrifices automatically equated to worthiness or guaranteed loyalty. The red pill concepts, stripped of their often toxic online context, became a crucible where his pain was forged into understanding. He learned that he had neglected himself, his own needs, his own boundaries. He had given away his power by making his happiness entirely dependent on another person's actions, a person who ultimately didn't value the man, only perhaps the provision. The realization was painful, humbling, but ultimately empowering. He started to rebuild, not a future for someone else but himself. He focused on his own strength, his own character, his own peace. The silence in his room was no longer an echo of betrayal, but a space for quiet growth. Years passed. The sharp edges of the betrayal had softened into a dull ache, a scar that served as a constant, quiet reminder of the lessons learned. Ryan Wells still worked, still built things with his hands, but the frantic, relentless pace was gone. He worked smart, set boundaries, and refused overtime that would consume his life without a clear, reciprocal purpose. He lived in a simple, clean apartment that was entirely his own space. It wasn't grand, not the fortress he had once envisioned, but it was comfortable, peaceful, and authentically his. He cooked his own meals, read books that expanded his understanding of the world, and spent quiet evenings in his own company. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with his own thoughts, his own peace. He was still a man of few words, quiet and observant, but the silence now stemmed not from repression, but from contentment. He didn't need external noise or constant validation to feel whole. The strength he had found wasn't loud or aggressive. It was the quiet resilience of a man who knew his own worth, independent of anyone else's approval or affection. He hadn't sworn off relationships entirely, but his perspective had fundamentally shifted. He understood now that genuine connection wasn't about one person sacrificing endlessly, while the other passively received or, worse, took advantage. It was about two individuals, whole and self-respecting, choosing to build something together, sharing the effort, the support, and the respect equally. He sought mutual respect above all else, recognizing it as the true cornerstone of any lasting bond. Ryan Wells lived a simple life, free from the complex entanglements of his past. He was strong, not in the physical sense alone, but in his quiet conviction and self-possession. And he was silent, but it was the comfortable silence of a man at peace with himself who had weathered the storm of betrayal and emerged not bitter, but clear-eyed and hopeful. He had lost a false future, but found a truer, stronger version of himself. The lesson learned in pain had ultimately set him free. Prompts de thumbnail, Estilo Aquarella. Aquarella painting, 16.9 aspect ratio, depicting a man, Ryan Wells, in a simple, peaceful landscape, like a field or by calm water, looking towards a soft sunrise or horizon. The style should use washed colors and soft edges, conveying a sense of quiet strength, serenity, and hope after hardship.